telling Dorothy and Mohammed that it's the one silver lining of the lockdown has been that we've all become so much more comfortable doing these things. So even though I'm in London, it's wonderful to be able to talk to you guys there in Oklahoma, and I know scattered in other places as well. So thank you. So actually, it's kind of fitting for this book, which is quite an international book. Like as a way of introduction, I'm Deirdre Mask. I'm originally from North Carolina, so not too far away, but I currently live in London, and I started off as a lawyer and then quickly sort of moved into writing. And I sort of got into writing this book in kind of an odd way. And for those of you guys who have read it, you'll know that I was trying to just figure out the postal system. You know, when I mail a letter in Ireland to my dad in North Carolina, you know, is there somebody in the back, you know, calculating the stamp money owed to the US for delivering the mail? When I came across these facts that, you know, billions of people around the world don't have street addresses. And then I found out that in West Virginia, not that far from where I grew up, there were rural communities that didn't have street addresses. And I've spoken to so many of these groups who had similar childhood experiences in their own small towns. And so as I was, you know, researching the story and writing it up for the Atlantic magazine, I at first thought it was sort of this quirky story, just this sort of funny story about this patch of the world that didn't have the street addresses and all of the funny ways that they were naming them, you know, Beer Can Hollow when they came across beer cans at the end of the street, or Stacy Hollow because a lot of Stacys used to live in the street. But actually, I began to see it as a way of reflecting a lot of the social issues going on in the world. The more I looked into house numbering and street names and the ideas of, as the subtitle of the book is, identity, race, wealth, and power, I realized that street addresses sort of offered this spine to think about a lot of the social justice issues that are going on around us. And they become sort of a way of telling about these and also sort of, you know, exploring the ramifications of things that are going on in the world, from disease to race, to class, to homelessness, everything. So that's sort of my, you know, my general spiel in introducing the book. But it's an international book, so it's so great to talk to a community that's international, and to get people's reactions. And I'm happy to answer any questions at all.
Great, thank you. And I know people who are familiar with the book know it was a finalist for the 2020 Kirkus Prize for Nonfiction and was included in Time Magazine's 100 Must-Read Books of 2020. And so one of the things I was struck by in the Time, it says how you tied together place, power, and identity through Mask's absorbing and thoughtful voice. And I thought that was really true, because when I started reading it, it felt as if it was like conversation almost with the stories that you related. So you talked a little bit about how you came to write the book, which is always interesting to me, about what sparked this idea. So tell us a little bit about research methods. What was most productive for you?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's a book that uses a lot of different research. So a lot of it's interviews, as you know. So the first sort of major chapter is journalistic, really. So I had this odd experience in the Kolkata chapter. And even to go back, once I started realizing this was a more important story, you know, one of the reasons I realized this was that people started, articles published in a big magazine, and I started to get all these letters from all around the world, you know, talking about their home street addresses in Beirut or their street addresses in Texas. So, you know, I started just collecting literally stories, just things people were telling me. And so it became almost journalistic that I would just, you know, just read everything about it and came across different organizations. And often it would go like this, that they came across this organization that was doing the addressing in Calcutta. And I called them up and they're like, great, you know, and I happened to be in Ireland. My husband's from Northern Ireland. And I met with the founder and he's like, you should come out to Calcutta with me. And I was like, great. But then we organized the trip. And it turned out, you know, just a couple days before, his partner was unwell and he had to stay back. He couldn't go. And so this was sort of a weird, you know, I was sort of sent in a way to Kolkata on my own, you know, which was a bit, you know, nerve-wracking at the last minute, but actually it turned out to be for the best, really, because I got to see everything that they were doing firsthand. You know, I really just followed them around the whole time I was in Kolkata, and they were so warm and so welcoming to showing me the problems of addresslessness and what it was like, you know, for people to get addresses and how their system worked. So a lot of it was sort of journalistic like that. But a lot of it was just research. I always make the point that I spent a lot of time in the British Library, which is the big library here in London, and I would have these stacks of books that had the most random assortment of books, and I would joke around with the librarians because I'd be getting a book on, Hangul, which is the Korean writing system. I'd have a book on cholera, I'd have another book on identity and homelessness, and people just couldn't work out what I was writing about. And then especially when I told them I was writing a book about street addresses, what does any of this have to do with it? But I spent a long time writing this book, and I've made this joke before that I would tell people I was writing a book about street addresses, and they would like slowly back away because it sounded so incredibly boring at the dinner party. They turned to the other side. But it really did become, as you say, sort of a lens to look at all these other issues and to tell all these stories that I found really powerful.
That's right. Yeah. Well, one of my questions was going to be about your formal studies that made you address this topic, so I don't know if it was just that thought about sending the letter to your dad.
Well, I had all these formal studies. I'm like overeducated really for what I do because I went to law school. I did do a classics degree. My first degree was in classics, and so actually one of the chapters is on ancient Rome and navigating ancient Rome, and actually a lot of the sources that I used for that. In terms of the authors that I cite, like Seneca and Terence at the end, were things that I read that I knew. So in some ways, I did draw a bit on my sort of classical studies, and I asked one of my old professors to read the chapter to make sure I was making sense and the like. But no, I'm actually kind of a weird person to have written this geography book. I'm a lawyer by training. I really just kind of got pulled into it. And I think some of the enthusiasm that's conveyed in the book is really because I'm kind of learning along with the reader in a way. I'm not, I wouldn't before this have been an expert on, Japanese script or, cholera or, the practice of grid or, any of the William Penn. So it was really an education in itself. I had to learn, I spent so long on every topic, learning about it, talking to all the scholars I could get who could talk to me so that I could understand it myself in order to convey it. So I think some of the enthusiasm in the book is because I became so enthusiastic about it as I was learning about it.
I think that's really evident in the book because readers can feel that. Those of you who've read the book already may have already made that assessment, but I certainly did. Because this is not the type of book I would typically pick up.
Thank you.
It is engaging. Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm so pleased. Good.
Well, this is kind of an off the wall, but in virtual meetings that you've been having, have you had anything surprising from members of the audience who ask a question and commented?
Yeah, I think the surprising thing, it shouldn't be surprising to me because I know the extent of addresslessness, but the number of people who say, well, I grew up and I didn't have an address in this place, in America, how recent in so many rural communities that street addresses were, which I don't think, even having been to West Virginia, I don't think I was aware of. But other things come up. I had a phone conversation recently, for example, with someone who'd found the book who's from Beirut. And you remember there was that, that blast in Beirut, which I think really, because so much was going on in 2020, I feel like, it would have been an even bigger story. It's just this, incredible power blast. And he was working with a mapping organization to basically give street addresses in Beirut, which has never had street addresses, for aid purposes, because they need to find people and know where people are in order to give them aid. So they were working alongside the Lebanese army to address all these places. So he was looking for the kind of practical advice that I couldn't give. I said, I could give you the theory behind it. But, so it was interesting because it was such a real life model for why it's so necessary for us to be able to find people. And in a place like Beirut, which, he said, for example, there were buildings that had been destroyed during the Civil War that had never really been, fixed up. They were still kind of tattered. So they're even figuring out, what was damaged by the blast, what was previous damage, and how to find everybody was incredibly difficult. And for aid purposes, they really need to do that. So they're working on their own addressing project now for a humanitarian effort. And so, things like that make you realize that this is something that's an ongoing concern that's still incredibly important.
Yes. Well, I am one of those who grew up in a very small town
Yeah.
there are street names, but there are no street signs. And so the
Yes.
houses do not have numbers. People either have a post office box or they get general delivery mail. So
Yeah.
maybe if anybody else has grew up in this kind of situation, you can put it in the chat.
Yes.
I have a comment that
Okay.
comes to that.
Yeah.
Let me grab it back here. This is from John Thompson. He says, thanks for reminding me that my grandfather, a Choctaw code talker during World War I, lived until the late 1960s. He always used the address of his name, then antlers, and an I.T. The post office knew that that meant Indian territory.
Wow. Wow. It's amazing. I've written a bit about Native American reservations not having street addresses and how this, how this influences their lives and actually how it hurts them. So voting, for example, they were sort of, there were rules about having to have a street address to vote, that basically left a lot of people flailing on Native American reservations. So that's a really interesting point for me.
Thank you.
Well, Amanda and I were discussing the address book, and we were struck by your story about Shelby Foote. Would you just comment about a little bit on his ability to reconcile two really disparate ideas?
Yeah, so that comes up for people who aren't aware of it in the Civil War chapter. And I think a lot of people would have seen Shelby Foote in Ken Burns's documentary where this is a documentary on the Civil War. And Shelby Foote's a Southerner, and he gives quite a sympathetic portrayal of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a Confederate general and is widely seen as the founding member of the KKK. And so he has a certain view of the Civil War, while also, to be fair, talking about Northern generals as well. But I was always struck by his admiration for Nathan Bedford Forrest. And I imagine what Dorothy's talking about is that I was thinking about this in relation to a street that was named after Nathan Bedford Forrest, and how can people admire this man? And I thought about Shelby Foote and how he would talk about, Forrest's valor and battle. But it was interesting. I also found another interview with him where Shelby Foote was known for his very beautiful accent. Southern, very rich Southern accent. People always compare it to food, like Slola's molasses or something. And he said, this comes from, I don't have the quote on top of my head, but he basically says this comes from Black people, because I was basically, everything that happened in my life basically was because of Black people. He had a nanny who he was as close to as his own family. He had, every bit of clothing, every food he ate, everything was sort of produced by Black people. And I thought it was interesting that he was able to balance these feelings of great respect for a, Confederate officer who was a major slave trader, and these people, the Black people who cared for him, that in his mind, he was able to balance these two things. And I think this is one of the reasons why, these Confederate street names do become so divisive, because people have this idea that these two things can be reconciled. And in general, in the book, I'm fairly neutral. Neutral is not the word, but I try to stand back a bit from the book. And I think that's one chapter where, maybe because I'm Black myself, or, just maybe because I think it's right. I think that's one where I come in and I make the point that, no, I don't think these two feelings are reconcilable at all.
Yeah, very good. Amanda?
Dorothy, can I jump in with something?
Yes, sure.
They're starting to stack up.
Right.
Okay.
This is a thought from George Rasco, and I apologize to anybody who I mess up your name, because this is microscopic print on my iPad.
Okay.
I have not had a chance to read the book, but I will, he says.
Yeah.
I would like to hear your thoughts on how a child's address and or addresses growing up affect them as adults.
Interesting. I mean, there's different ways of thinking about it. I mean, you could actually think about the actual, there's the nostalgia point people make. I think about my life in terms of my childhood street addresses. But I think your point probably goes to a broader point of, how where you live really affects, the outcomes of your life. And there has been lots of studies about, how different places in America, for example, affect your ability to get out of poverty. And I think a way of thinking about it, which I've said before, and I've done for, talked about, if you close your eyes and think about the place where you grew up, you can probably map out pretty well, where different people in your community live. So when I close my eyes, I think about my own town, I know where the country club set lives. There's a more bohemian neighborhood. There was a neighborhood that was largely African-American. There was a neighborhood that was largely a growing population of Hispanic Americans. There were I can sort of map it out. And when you think about that, our space is so often divided this way, and that outcomes and are often linked to where we live. Then it does become really important as you travel through life, where you grew up and how you grew up, and sometimes even minor differences. In St. Louis, for example, there are places that are only a few miles apart that just have such dramatic outcomes, and wealth and poverty and health, that it doesn't necessarily make sense given their closeness to each other, but the social forces just push them in different directions. So I think it probably has a huge effect on life.
Thank you. Dorothy,
Yeah.
can I do one more?
Sure, yes.
This is from Daryl Howard.
Hmm.
He says, you hit the idea of street names and equity. Have you found that people who historically live on certain streets, particularly in America, have been profiled and denied access to opportunities because of their addresses?
Yeah, I mean, this comes up sometimes. And in fact, this comes up. So in the book, for example, I talk about homelessness and in how people are discriminated against on job applications. If you're homeless, if you list no address, or if you list a shelter address, employers often recognize that. And because of historic discrimination against the homeless, will choose not to hire you. So there's that element. But when I was reading more about this recently, this isn't in the book, people often say that about street names in your town. So there may be a street in your town that's known for being, name it, a street that was poorer than the rest, or scruffier than the rest, or, maybe it's a street where a lot of African Americans live on. So there's a lot of racism against people who live on that street. So they're able to tell your race from the street. There are lots of people who report this. And it comes up in the book a bit when I talk about, there's a chapter on streets named after Martin Luther King, for example, where I make the point that that one of the reasons people would say they didn't want a Martin Luther King Jr. street was that they thought it was bad for business, right? And this is because they thought they were, bad streets. Largely, I sort of conclude because they're Black, they're often Black streets. People have called them Black America's Main Street, even though by all means, a lot of them actually are quite integrated or run through, posh neighborhoods. So there is a sense that people make assumptions about you and about your life based on your address. Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm going to tell a little story here.
Yeah.
When I moved to Tulsa as an adult, and eventually got a job at a college, at the college in North Tulsa, I knew somebody that was a native Tulsan, and he told me that his car turned south at Admiral. Now, to those of you who are from Tulsa, he was saying that the scruffier part of town was north of this street, and the, middle class, acceptable was south of that street. And he wondered why I would want to be going into North Tulsa. Well, when we moved here, that's where we rented a house. I didn't know there was anything about Tulsa. And I honestly found great people north and south of Admiral, but that was a street name that meant something to somebody who grew up here.
Exactly. And these street names become, in the same way we think about street names like, you could say the street name Broadway, that means something to you, or in London, Baker Street or something like that. These street names, they don't become not street names at all. They become signifiers of something else. And it sounds like they're a class divide or a race divide or something like that. It becomes symbolic of something much more than the actual street. So I think it's a great example.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Your inclusion of specific stories about people and lack of address makes the issue come alive. So how did you decide to arrange the material?
Yeah, that was a real challenge, arranging this material, because and if those of you who have read the book, or even those of you who haven't read the book, it's chaptered based on different places. So there's a chapter on Calcutta, there's a chapter on Haiti, there's a chapter on St. Louis. And so I think initially I had thought they would all kind of come together rather than to be these self-contained chapters. But they didn't really. They really were sort of standalone chapters. So then I sort of got the idea, and talking with my editor and my agent, to divide them up into these themes. So, with this, there's development, and that development is where I talk about, addresslessness and epidemiology, which is really how addresses are used in tracking disease, which is quite relevant now. With COVID-19, this is a big issue, and it's a hallmark of epidemiology. And then there's a chapter on class where I talk about almost the opposite of what we were talking about before, how certain street names elevate you in a certain way, and homelessness. And then there's race, which is I discuss Confederate street names, the streets named after Martin Luther King, and I also talk about South Africa. I talk about politics, and when I talk about Berlin, for example, during World War II, and Jewish streets named after Jewish people. So I sort of decided to arrange it thematically, though in truth, every chapter could probably stand alone. It's a book you could just dip into and read an individual chapter.
I think that's another advantage to it too. You can read it by chapter and then come back to it for reflection.
Yeah, and everybody has something different they like. Like some people's favorite chapter was, somebody said, "Oh, I didn't like that chapter as much," and then the other people love that chapter. So I think there's something in it for everyone.
There is. Amanda, do you want to ask another from the chat?
Yes, hang in there. It went away on me. Okay, this one is from Zuleha Sesser. Early in the book on page 24, you mentioned, quote, embracing the exuberant charm of Calcutta. I'm going to say Calcutta.
Yeah.
Will you talk a little bit about your experience there as you researched addresses?
Yeah. So I had an amazing time in India. And as I said, I went because my, the director, I was supposed to go with him, and then he couldn't unfortunately go at the last minute, though luckily his partner was fine. So so I was a bit anxious about it, and then I was going on my own to add my own personal thing to it. I had over the course of writing this book, I had 2 daughters, and my youngest daughter was actually still quite small, and she was still nursing. So I was kind of going off on this trip kind of on my own at this point. So in that sense, I was quite anxious, but I think that quote you pulled out is exactly that thing. It almost is like what we were talking about with Admiral Street. I think I just had this idea of Calcutta, all you hear about is the extreme poverty and the slums and the just the despair. To me, it was linked with that. And I'm not saying that there isn't that element to Kolkata, but it's actually an exuberant, charming, wonderful place. I mean, and even you have these places that are slums, and I was wary of using that term, but it's actually a term of art. It's actually describes something specific, a specific kind of place. Where yes, all the things we were seeing that you talk about, and they were all quite different. Some of them were much, worse than others in terms of poverty levels. But there was a buzz, there was excitement, there was people talking and playing board games, and vendors, hawking vegetables and things like that. And I never felt I never felt unsafe at all. And in fact, I felt quite the opposite. I felt very welcomed. And the culture, I mean, there's jazz clubs, and we went to this mile-long book market, and there's just, and people just talk about culture and books and art, and and so much. Even my guide Sebastius, who's in the book, he just knew so much about music and poetry. He'd pick out a book of poetry for me to take home, and it was just it was just really just a completely fascinating place. I mean, it's colorful in every way. And I think, again, I had certain assumptions about what it would be like, that were absolutely wrong. And so it's a very complex place, I guess. So my reporting there was quite interesting because, I was really just following this team around to various places where they were doing it, and getting into all sorts of trouble, which I mentioned in the book. At some point, I get lost myself and have to go to a police station and ride a motorcycle, and the whole thing was a bit. I think I write about it in quite a funny way in the book because I think I was slightly traumatized at the time. But it was great. It was great. I'd love to go back. I highly recommend it. It really is a place to be seen. It's quite extraordinary.
That you're,
Thanks.
you're reporting about your getting lost, and that,
Yes.
that was it made it very human, I think.
Yes, yes. I was extremely human. If nothing else, it was extremely human. And it actually shows another point. I really did get lost because I was because I just there's an address card they give you, you know, at the hotel. But I had been relying on my guide so much that I just hadn't really thought about it. But of course, he had to. It was very late. We had gone to this very late meeting, so he was rushing to get home to his son. He now has a daughter as well, and you know, catch the train. And I just didn't know where I was going, and it was just that weird feeling. But you know, but there was something to it, you know. I spotted a police station, you know, I walked across, I had my passport out. I was recording all of this, by the way. I've actually thought about putting some of the recording on my website, but it's just too mortifying. But, you know, I go to the police station, but again, maybe I had a certain confidence because I was like, well, you know, American, I'm English, I've got some, you know, I did have sort of the confidence to kind of go in and say, you know, help me out. And luckily they did. I ended up having to sort of chase this motorcycle down as they guided me past to where I was going. But yeah, again, I fulfilled I satisfied my own point that how much addresses matter.
I thought it was a great story. I was glad you were safe. It is.
Yes, exactly. It's a good story in the telling after.
Yes. Amanda, do you have something else?
I have a couple more here.
Yeah.
This one is from Susanna Southard. Brief story about privilege. I grew up in a country where our neighbors tended to have more than we did. My parents went to a dealership to buy a car, and they were treated poorly because they didn't, quote, look the part of a profitable sale. When my mother provided our zip code, the salesperson's entire demeanor changed, and my parents were able to negotiate a deal on the car we needed.
Zip codes are really, really powerful. I did a podcast that talked a little bit about zip code marketing, and now you can look at it yourself. I'm blanking on the name of it, but you know, basically there are companies that have identified zip codes, and they'll say what they're like. You know, these are young urban professionals in this zip code. You know, they make up this percentage. So to be able to target and market people. And what this often does is it helps people who are rich, and it hurts people who are poor because they'll have, you know, struggling neighborhood. I'm not sure how they describe it, but then that might mean that a grocery store would choose not to go to that struggling neighborhood. They're going to choose to go to this other neighborhood, which means that resources are inadequately divided. So zip code marketing and understanding. And I remember even here, I went to the doctor once. I think it was when I was pregnant with my second daughter, and the doctor sort of chatting with me and taking my information, and they asked my zip code, and we weren't living where we're living now. And then he looked up from his pad and he said, quite posh. I said, oh, that's kind of interesting. You know, there's that relationship with the doctor where that gets in the way, because that tells you something about this person. Well, I'm not posh, but it was again, an interesting interaction where your zip code really matters.
Here's another one. This is from Richard Fisher. In fact, there are two from him.
Okay, yeah.
I just started the book and found the travails of the address namers in West Virginia amusing. I've often wondered about Atlanta, Georgia's obsession with Peachtree as a street name. Countless intersections featuring Peachtree Avenue, Peachtree Court, Circle, Terrace, etc. Seemingly endless variations. So that's his first comment. Then his follow-up says, I'd like to know Ms. Mask's thought on American voting disenfranchisement efforts based on the lack of addresses of address during the pandemic. No mail-in voting for those lacking an address.
Yeah, well, I can address both of those. The Peachtree thing is very interesting. I've heard this from a lot of people. I think it's just branding, you know, and the book kind of goes in, you know, you just brand something. So, you know, Georgia peaches, that this is, you know, this is the epitome of Georgia or something like that. But I think the Peachtree stuff is pure marketing, really, via street name. The disenfranchisement is an excellent point. And again, as I talking about in regards to earlier comment, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times that was about this, that was about different disenfranchisement of Native American voters who don't have street addresses on the reservations. And I argue that this was actually intentional. But yeah, exactly. The people who can't do mail-in addressing, the homelessness is incredibly difficult to vote. You know, there's always a struggle. You know, you are entitled to vote as a homeless person, obviously, but because you don't have an address, it can really make the process that much more difficult than it is for you know, typical person who can do their mail-in voting. So yeah, it's huge. It's hugely important. I mean, and this happens also for people who aren't, I mean, people who are RVers or people who live abroad. You know, this can be a difficult issue. Yeah.
Dorothy, I have one more here that's come up, so
Okay.
I think I'm go ahead
All
with it. This one's from Becky Andrews.
Yeah.
She asks, what do refugee camps do to find people? Do they have addresses?
That's a great question. Actually, occurs there's part of my book where it's talking about at one of the largest refugee camps. I believe it's in Jordan. I wouldn't quote me on that. I'd have to actually look up the book. That interestingly did give street addresses to the refugee camp, and people really liked them because they were street addresses that reminded them of home. You know, Olive Street, for example, they were dignified. And so there's a quote from somebody living in the refugee camps who said, "Yes, these are dignified addresses, and you know, I finally have an address." So there was that sense. But then there are people also finding other digital solutions as well. There's a few organizations, I think, you know, for humanitarian reasons, using digital addresses or naming streets and refugees. I know there was a Dutch group doing this, and I profile a company called What 3 Words, which has come up with their own sort of curious way of giving addresses. And I believe they've done quite a bit of work in refugee camps as well, you know, which are huge and sprawling and very difficult to get around. So I think some you know, have been given traditional street names, but I imagine a lot of them don't have them. But I don't know for sure.
Well, this is a good segue into this question. I was really taken with the story that you told about Chris Hildrey, the young architect in London.
Yes. Yeah.
I thought that was particularly moving. So would you talk about his way to help the homeless?
Yeah, Chris Hildrey is an amazing man. He's an architect, quite young. But he basically was setting out to think about design ideas to help the homeless. And what I think I can't remember if it was a mentor or somebody involved in homelessness outreach told him, don't just build a better tent. You know, and what they meant was, don't just build something that's going to make homelessness more palatable. So, you know, don't just build, you know, oh, we're going to have these small houses that'll house people. Come up with something more innovative than that. And basically, he did a lot of research and he came to the conclusion that others have come to, which is that what a lot of homeless people really lack is an address. So obviously, we know they lack homes. You know, housing first is the best way when to get them into homes. But not having an address was really hurting people's ability to do anything in life. So for example, without an address, it's very hard to get a bank account. So any money you save is very difficult. Without an address, you can't even get married in the UK. Without an address, you can't get letters from the NHS. It's really difficult to register for a doctor's appointment. You have to register with a GP practice. You know, there were all of these things. And most importantly, there's huge address discrimination. So you have to write an address on a job application, even though nobody's ever going to send you anything. So he's realizing that people need addresses. And interestingly, what I see as one of the most important things is that it's an identity. If you have an address, you feel comfortable, you know, with your identity. Not only can you receive mail, but you know, you can pass as not homeless, and passing as not homeless is actually a key part to not being homeless, because if you try to get a job and say you're homeless, then you're much less likely to get that job than if you can come in a way that looks like you aren't homeless and have an address. So to make a long story short, he came up with this idea that basically he was going to take the addresses of empty homes all over the UK. And it's a weird fact that, like, even in this crazy housing market that's here, there are many thousands of empty homes. And sometimes they're just empty for a short period of time because, you know, they're renovating or the owner has died and it's currently empty. But a lot of them, basically, especially in London, are just brick bank accounts. It's just people, really very wealthy people have sort of bought houses, you know, just to put their money in because the housing market has been so strong. And so he had this idea that you could give those addresses to homeless people, and it doesn't affect the people who live there because you don't actually own your address. It's the equivalent of forwarding mail. You know, if I move into a house and the person who's just left the house still has their mail forwarded, they're still using my address, but I don't know that because they're now away and all their mail is now being redirected to their new address. So it's something similar. It doesn't actually affect your mail. Their mail, the homeless person's mail, will just be redirected. And so he has this very clever very clever system. I think I could probably explain it better in the book, of doing this, that he's trialing in a council here in London. And it's basically designed to make sure that every homeless person has an address, and that homeless person can simply forward that mail to wherever they're staying, the shelter they're staying at, the friend's house they're staying at, and they would have the power over how they receive their mail.
I thought that was a really remarkable story. It
Yeah.
really stood out to me.
Yes, he's amazing, and I think it's going to be big.
Mhm. And all it took was, for somebody to say to him, don't make a better tent.
Yes,
Do something
exactly.
else. Yeah.
Exactly. Find another structural way of fixing the problem rather than just making it palatable to everybody else.
Okay, tell us something you left out of the book.
Oh gosh, yes. I had a whole chapter that I left out, mostly because I didn't have the word count. But it was actually oddly about sex offenders. So it was about Chicago, and so as everybody in the U.S. at least probably knows, there are very strict rules about where sex offenders can live. It varies in different places. So basically, you have to not live within a certain distance from a school or a certain distance from a playground. And these laws are well intentioned, but actually what they mean is that it's really hard for sex offenders to live anywhere, and a lot of them end up homeless, which is the exact worst thing that can happen to somebody who's struggling. And so there was a lawsuit in Chicago that was basically about people who were now labeled as sex offenders, who were in prison, and they weren't able to be released ever, basically because they couldn't find some place to live, because the term of their release was that they had to find some place to live, and they couldn't. Literally, there was like just no place that did that met all of these requirements. So they were essentially in jail for life. It was the idea if they could never get out and get an address. And so I sort of explore this idea about these laws and about how they operate and the people that they affect, and some of the rules about where people could live. It wasn't even just about the address. This is why it was only sort of tangential and ended up coming out, were things like, people would say, there can't be pictures in the home of children, even if you aren't a child sex offender. There can't pictures in the home that aren't of children, even if that child is yourself, which I just thought was just kind of mind-blowing. But it basically meant that there was no rehabilitation for these people, whereas somebody who had killed somebody could live wherever they wanted. And one of the very interesting stories about that was I told the story of Patty Wetterling, who was the mother of Jacob Wetterling, who I think the name has sort of gone out, but he was he was a child who was abducted and murdered, even though it was only recently they discovered who actually did it. And his mother had become, an advocate for families of victims, and her son's name was actually on one of these early acts that helped to track sex offenders. And she actually has ended up changing her mind about them and thinking that they actually are very damaging. And they actually, they don't help the cause. And in fact, maybe they help people to reoffend. And she has actually become quite activist in the other direction, even though she lost her child, because she's realized the harm of this. So it's a complicated story, and it's one that's not as closely tied to addresses, so it didn't make it. But it was still just fascinating to think about, and an important issue.
Okay, thanks. Amanda, do you have another one?
I have a question. This
Yeah.
one, it's titled From the Dialogue Institute. So
yeah,
it's somebody official.
Okay.
The question, it says the question is from Kathleen Guzman.
Yeah.
Have you done any work re the addresses and service of process or personal notice, etc., within the legal system?
Yeah.
More generally, so interesting how place and identity can intersect. It is almost as though our names are, in a sense, our personal address too.
Oh, it's such an interesting question, Kathleen. Yeah, no, I haven't done that much, though I know from law school about these connections between service and finding people. But yeah, but it goes back to the point about identity is exactly that. When we're giving our address, like even the homelessness example, often when you're giving your address, say to an employee or to a bank, it's not so that they can actually physically find you. It's really because that's how we confirm identity. That's how we deal with identity. So your address really does just become sort of a legal, becomes an identity for you, as much as, nobody's expecting the bank manager to ever knock on your door. I mean, I don't even get mail from my bank anymore. But it does become so linked with you as sort of a person and identity that it becomes, hugely important.
Well, can you tell us about one of the biggest surprises that you discovered in doing your research?
That's a great question. I think one of my biggest surprises comes from the chapter that's about numbered streets in America. And this was something I'd noticed, but when it was actually pointed out to me, I was shocked by it, just about how in Europe, there are basically, very few numbered streets. There's pockets of communities. There's one pocket of community in a place called Milton Keynes in the UK. And there's there's a place in Germany, but for the most part, there's no numbered streets. And in fact, some countries have even, Estonia has banned them, and in times when Europeans have thought, there's a story, I believe, from Spain, where they were, people said, oh, let's just number these streets that had been named after fascists or something like that. And people said, no, we don't want that. So Europe has completely rejected numbered streets, but America entirely embraced them, it's starting in Philadelphia, but all across America, numbered streets. I believe Second Street is according to census data, the most popular, or one of the most popular street names in Second Street, because a lot of first streets are actually main streets. So so exploring the reasons behind that, why Americans would love numbered streets and why Europeans have rejected them, actually revealed these other ideas about American democracy and how Americans saw themselves as different and more rational, and in every way from Europe. So I found that really surprising, especially as an American living in Europe. So.
Well, I think people who live in this area could really relate to that chapter, because we have lots of numbered streets.
Yes, exactly. So it's interesting, because some people would tell me, like, oh, my street doesn't have that much meaning, it's just a numbered street. And your street actually does have a lot of meaning, because there's something extremely American about numbered streets. So it's not just this sort of neutral street name. It was very much how early Americans, I can't really say early Americans, because talk about Native Americans, but how people like Thomas Jefferson, for example, saw America.
That's good, and not something I had really given much thought to after I moved here. They were just, the streets are numbered, and
well, I hear sitting here on 57th Street.
Right.
We have a few more questions I can send your way.
Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, this one is from, first off, there's an exhortation. Be sure and send in your questions so we can get them in.
Yeah.
And then this next comment was from Deanna, and it may be Deanne, sorry, Weber. I know your wonderful book just came out, but I'm curious about what you're working on next.
Oh, okay.
Did your research for this book send you down a rabbit hole towards another related subject?
Oh, it's a great question. I wish I knew what I was working on.
One of my questions.
Oh, yeah.
I thought that might be true.
I would love to know what I'm working on next. Nothing really, because I've been sort of talking about my book and writing about my book. But there are some things, and it actually goes back to the question about what didn't make it into the book. There are some ideas about the Enlightenment. So one of the chapters in the book about house numbering is really about the Enlightenment, and basically the idea that the Enlightenment was very scientific and rational, and it was designed to find people and organize in a way that hadn't been done before. And there's lots of really interesting writings by people like Rousseau, for example, who were obsessed with transparency, almost like glass. They had this idea of transparency, that if we could only see each other, if we could only communicate, without all of these boundaries between us, that was the vision of utopia. And he tells it through this story that I love about, there was a time when he was a young boy, and there was a comb that was like drying on the counter. And he was the only one in the room. But when the lady of the house came in, the combs, what are the things called? The bristles on the combs, I can't remember what they're called, were sort of torn out. The comb was broken, basically. And he was the only one in the room, so he had to have done it. And yet he says he didn't do it. And so, he's punished for this. And so to him, this was the end of his childhood, because he realized that people couldn't understand him. They couldn't see him. He wasn't transparent. So this probably isn't making much sense, but I'm very interested in Rousseau's Comb. And there have been lots of things written about this, and this idea about this idea of transparency, and it affects ideas about democracy. It affected ideas about the French Revolution. So I've been thinking about ways of tying this to some of the things that I write, but that's a long-winded ramble that basically I don't really know.
Well, I have a story from someone. Let's see.
Yeah.
This is from George Rasco. This is great Oklahoma City historical story. He leads it.
Ooh.
Dr. Edwards was an African-American developer in Oklahoma City in the early 1940s. He specifically came back to his boyhood town to build the first neighborhood of well-built homes for African-American families. The streets that were off the grid and that he could assign a name, he named uplifting names like Success and Leader's Circle. The people who still live there today have told me that the houses on those streets sold first. Unfortunately, no banks would finance the Black families to purchase those homes. So Dr. Edwards also became the banker and offered mortgages as well. It is still a nice neighborhood with very well-sustained homes, the Edwards neighborhood.
That is fascinating. And that's
Pretty
such a
cool.
link to, it's amazing. It's a link between street names and place. And there's a great book that's called The Color of Law, which describes exactly those problems about mortgaging. And I mean, it's a shattering book about these ideas. But yeah, Success and Leader's Circle, amazing. I think I'd want to live on Leader's Circle. I'd sign up for
Wouldn't
that.
that be great?
Exactly.
And then one more from Becky Andrews.
Yeah.
What has the general reaction been to your book? Any reaction that surprised you?
Oh, great. I think reaction has been positive. I think the book got very good reviews. And, I think I'm talking to groups like this. And I think what really surprised me is how much people are into the book. Because as I said, when you're working on it, it seems like this sort of esoteric topic and people sort of smile and nod when you're talking about it. So the fact that people have responded to the book and that people have so many feelings about their own addresses and that this links into so many of the things that people have been thinking about in their own lives and the way they see their cities and the world. That really surprises me. I'm also amazed at how many people can find lessons in the book. I think I was often telling these stories, but I sometimes talk to, like groups of people who are interested in cities or changing cities and rejuvenating cities. And we have really interesting conversations about ideas in the book that relate to their work. And I find that really exciting because I was coming to this as an outsider. I find it really interesting that I can connect with some things that were going on now. So really just the fact that I have gotten such a good reception and that people are so interested in the issue, has been surprising in a very good way.
I have one correction to make.
Yeah.
I've been reading this micro print and I messed it up. It's Georgie.
Georgie.
Rasco.
Got it.
Well, I
Humble
think
apologies
Sorry,
to Georgie.
that's okay. We'll forgive you for it. It is tiny
Yeah.
print. One of the things I think that's easy to understand about the reaction when people do pick the book up and start reading is how engaging your writing is. Because as I said earlier, and it really made me feel as if it were a conversation, which would keep me reading rather than, okay, I won't finish this.
Yes.
But the stories are so engaging. And then the little things that like Chris Hindley, and your trip to Calcutta, those things I think really add to it. I'd like to ask though, is there some place you wish you could have gone that was, not possible because of time?
Yes, exactly. Japan, really. I mean, the Japan chapter was really written just from home. I was calling people up. I was reading a lot about it. I was talking to scholars, but I really wanted to get lost in Japan. I was just desperate to get lost in Japan, but I ran out of time and money, basically. So I ended up sort of reporting that quite academically, which was actually in some ways quite good because it sort of forced me to read a lot, which is how I came up with these interesting ideas about script in the Japanese city. This amazing geographer, an urban planner called Barry Shelton. But it's nice you say that about the engaging voice. It was interesting when I was, the way you write a nonfiction book is you write write a proposal and a sample chapter, and then you send it to a lot of editors. And a lot of editors didn't like the voice actually of the book because they thought it was too light for such serious issues. So I think what they were worried about is that you have this sort of, some parts of the book are quite funny. I hope they tend to be quite funny, and some are quite serious. But I think some of the editors felt a bit uncomfortable talking about issues like this in this sort of funny, sometimes amused way. Obviously, I don't, and I think it works. And I think there are times when I'm much more serious in the book. I'm not cracking any jokes. But then there are times when it's lighter, and throughout I try to use storytelling to make my point. But yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that because initially I think some editors were worried about it being sort of an amusing voice.
That's good. But you could write this weighty tone that nobody picks up.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's not the kind of writer exactly. That wouldn't be me.
And I think conversations such as this will engage other readers to think, oh, well, I'd like to know that, even if you just dip in and out of the book.
Yeah, you absolutely can. It's supposed to be very accessible and fun and not something you have to read cover to cover.
We probably already know the answer to this question, but I think I must ask, since we're in this worldwide pandemic, how has this exacerbated the problem of lack of address?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's huge. I mean, and I think it's interesting because there's a chapter about epidemiology and cholera that was written long before COVID-19. And but it did make me think about this. It helps you think, for example, you would look at quarantine orders in Australia or someplace like that, or in the UK for that matter. And they would define things by zip codes and addresses and neighborhoods. You would see even in the way people discuss space and COVID, these neighborhoods that were so mapped out. And this idea that comes up that the government needs to be able to see everybody and to find everybody. And this is one of the justifications for, for house numbers. We have to see and find everybody. You feel that much more in a time of a pandemic when the government does actually want to see people and find people and regulate where they are and send ambulances to you when you need it. And who's eligible for the vaccine, who's in our lists. These are all things that are related to the same ideas that motivate addresses, and that do make it harder for places that don't have them to regulate as much different populations. So you see places like Singapore, which has done relatively well against COVID-19 because they have a state that's highly surveillance based, sort of a surveillance state. They really are able to find people and track them down and make very specific quarantine orders and show up at your door and do all of this because that's the way their society is organized. Now, there's pros and cons to this, obviously, but for something like a pandemic, it is a good thing. But even interestingly, in Singapore, I wrote an article for the Financial Times a while ago about this, where there was at least one point during the pandemic when they had COVID-19 pretty much under control, but then it started flaring up in these sort of I guess they're almost like migrant dormitories. I guess they're sort of like worker dormitories. And I thought it was interesting that it was these people, and probably the most marginalized people in the society, who are living in these sort of dormitories, that were the ones that they weren't seeing. It kind of maps on to how we count people and how we see people, that those were the people who are getting overlooked. I don't know much more about it than that, but I thought that sort of showed, the state's ability to see and find and regulate people is linked with ideas of power. And I don't know, that's my theory, at least.
Yeah, thank you. That's good.
I have a comment and a question that's come in. This is from Bria Clark. I really appreciate the light tone because life is heavy enough. As a working mom, I also appreciated the story of you included about pumping.
Exactly. Brett, you're the first person who has ever mentioned that. And I'm so glad that you did. I've done so many of these talks with the first person because it's so interesting, because this is something, and I'm not embarrassed to talk about it, but I was nursing my daughter when I was on this trip. And to keep up your supply, you have to pump milk as you go along. And I was trying to explain this to the copy editor for my book. And he's like, I just don't understand, but your daughter wasn't there. And I was like, yeah, well, you have to like pump and dump. And I was explaining all of this in great detail to this like male young copy editor who just didn't understand it. And at some point I had a battle between, I can't remember who it was, two of my different readers, somebody who thought I should leave this out because it was like irrelevant. But I was like, no, God, I'm going to include that because it was such a big part of the thing. And I didn't want to hide that this was something that was going on and the kinds of things that people who are nursing experience when they're doing projects like this. So I'm glad I left it in, but nobody ever brings it up. So I'm glad you did.
This will be your memorable question.
Exactly. And I had to clarify it for the editor, and I had to change the wording a bit to make it clear for people who weren't aware of pumping.
Can I jump in just
Yeah,
briefly? Bria Clark, who asked the question, she is also the mayor of one of our city, Norman. She does many things besides
brilliant.
Asking
That's
this
great.
question. So we so appreciate her.
Exactly. So you are certainly a working mother who would understand the pumping story. So you're the perfect person to mention that. So thank you for bringing that up.
I have a question. This is from Becky Andrews. You've written previously for the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Guardian. What subjects have you written about before this book?
Yeah, gosh, I wrote a range of things. I did a master's in writing now, but of course, now that you say that, I blank on it because now my mind just sees addresses. I think the only thing I've written that became sort of viral, I actually really like it, but it was an article about, it was also an article for the Atlantic that was about NPR reporters' names. I was making these points of why do NPR reporters have these unusual names? People still email me about the story, and the upshot of it was that it was quite a sort of funny article. Was that we have a multicultural America now, so a lot of these funny names that we think of, a lot of them have like very interesting stories behind them. Actually come because we have this multicultural America, the age of Barack Obama, we all don't have these sort of neutral names. So that was one little thing, but a lot of it was sort of academic writing. I went to law school, I was on the law review there. So I wrote, several law review articles of things that were, on the federal jurisdiction and other things like that. I'm trying to think, I wrote a few essays, I wrote an article about Irish history and things like that. But once I sort of got on the beat of addresses, some of the chapters in this book also were articles before they were in the book. So the West Virginia piece, the St. Louis piece, those were also articles. So yeah, a range of things, but quite different from this.
And a last comment that I have so far.
Yeah.
This is from Stephanie Johnson Tolliver.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for this wonderful book. Mapping and street names makes me curious about a lot of things. I've lately been intrigued about the history of my house and the people who lived in it, built in 1909. Yep, the rabbit hole.
Yes, exactly. I think it does make you, I wonder if the pandemic has done this as well. I think as lockdown, we're so interested in home as well and space. We're becoming more interested in our neighborhoods and the places where we live. And street addresses actually even combine into house research. So some of the research that I did in London, for example, where the street names have changed so often in London that you need a guide. So if you're doing genealogy, for example, and the genealogy says your great-great-grandmother was born in 1900 on, 20, Peach Street, we'll say that, that probably has changed at some point. So people need like guides to say, okay, 20 Peach Street is now, 10 Monroe Avenue or something, whatever. So some of this actually does become important, so you can actually figure out where you're living and how it corresponds to a previous map. But yeah, absolutely, the homes and the history of the places we live is totally fascinating. I remember that when we the flat that we live in now, when we got the survey for it, there's a little damage to the brick in the front, but not serious. The surveyor just wrote, oh, it's probably, it could have been a bomb, something from the bomb on the Blitz, the Blitz bombs, because some of the buildings in our street were bombed. And he just sort of wrote that in sort of haphazardly, like, it could have been debris from a, and I was like, really? Like, oh, wow, yeah. So houses on the street were bombed by the Germans? You don't even think about that. And it wasn't that long ago. So there is so much history there that we take for granted.
Well, we've had really fascinating questions, and the book is absolutely wonderful.
Oh,
So I
thank
just
you so
wanted
much.
to change gears just a little
Yeah.
bit. Tell us about a book from your childhood that you have
Oh,
great memories
gosh.
of.
That's a good question. So this actually goes back to a point you were making, Dorothy, which is you were saying you ordinarily wouldn't pick up a book like that, and I wouldn't either because most of what I read is fiction. I am a great fiction reader, and I think that started largely in childhood. So yeah, I mean, I think all the classics that many people are familiar with, like To Kill a Mockingbird. I remember I read that in the 6th grade, and that totally changed my trajectory. I read lots of things like, the Babysitter's Club. And I think in general, I was deeply interested sort of early on in storytelling. And I can never tell if this is a healthy thing for those of you who read a lot as a child. I can never tell if this is a healthy thing or this is an escapist thing. But I was always really interested in anything with stories. I always really liked stories of people who are a bit of outsiders. So probably my favorite novel is a novel called The Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers,
Yes,
which is a
Which
beautiful,
was-
and it's a beautiful, I remember I read it when I was quite young, and I've reread it many, many times since. And it's amazing story, but it's also a story of somebody who feels very much like an outsider. I don't know if this is how I felt when I was a child. I'm sure there's a therapist or a psychoanalyst who could probably tell me more about this, but I've always been interested in those kinds of stories. But in general, to be honest, I was pretty, broad in my reading as a kid. I think I just really liked stories. And I think that probably is reflected a lot in my writing, and why I probably wouldn't write a weighty tome, because I would just want to keep telling stories probably.
Okay. Amanda, you have one more.
Yes. This is from Cameron McBride.
Yeah.
She says, who are some of your favorite authors? Were there any that you were influenced by?
Yeah. Oh, I have so many favorite authors. In terms of nonfiction, like Zadie Smith, for example, she's known for her novels, but she's an amazing essayist. So I often, read her for inspiration. Any other sort of nonfiction writers that I admire? Oh, now, of course, I can think of there's so many that I rely on. Anybody who writes for, I don't know if people are fan of the New Yorker magazine. So the famous New Yorker writers like Calvin Trillin and Susan Orlean, Nick Baumgarten, they've all written articles and things like that I think have inspired me. So I think that whole sort of New Yorker set. And then in terms of novelists, I think I will read absolutely anything. I'm trying to think of what I'm reading now. I'm reading some by Penelope Lively now that I love. But yeah, pretty much for fiction, any kind of literary fiction I will enjoy, and often not so literary fiction either, I have to say. But I have a pretty wide taste, and I teach writing as well. I teach creative nonfiction and advanced creative nonfictions with class I'm teaching now. So I rely a lot on the kinds of things in my syllabus, like Janet Malcolm for people who read the New Yorker and things like that. But I'm pretty broad. It's hard to pinpoint just one.
I got another question in. This is from Chase Borchard. Sorry if I butchered that one. Other than informing and positively impacting people through writing, what are some other aspirations you have?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I kind of feel like that's kind of my next question, actually, Chase. Like, in some ways, I wanted to write this book for so long. And now, having done it, I do sometimes have that feeling, which came out before, of what next. And I think I would love to have some more actual impact on some of these issues that I write about. For example, I talk about the story about talking with somebody in Beirut, but I felt like I wasn't able to help them as much as I would in a more practical way. And the same when I was talking to people who are reinvigorating cities. I'd love to get involved more actively, in not just a writing capacity in some of these ideas, but also more aspirations to do more teaching and thinking about this and connecting with people who are working on these issues. So I think that's probably the next step for me. But I wouldn't rule anything out, really.
I was glad you mentioned Susan Orlean, because
Yeah.
I read her book, and with the same thought in mind, I'm just going to
Yeah.
dip into a few pages.
Yes.
And got completely lost in the story.
Is that the library book? Is that her most recent one?
Yeah,
Amazing book.
Yes,
it's exactly the one I was thinking of as well.
I think I could liken her somewhat to yours in the way.
No. She's a great influence on me, and I teach her work. She's amazing.
That's to engage readers. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we just appreciate your time so much.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. This was such a pleasure.
I think that everybody's enjoyed and learned something, and if they haven't read the book, they'll be looking for it.
Oh, I hope they do. Yes, thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
I'm with Don Hockenberry
Yes.
here. With a big hoorah.
Oh, thank you guys. Thank you so much for choosing it. It's such a delight.
Oh, thank you so much. I think Mayor Clark, she has a question.
Of course.
So, Mayor Clark, can you hear us?
Yes. And forgive me
Okay.
for not having my camera on. I mentioned that working mom thing. I'm
Yes.
multitasking. But love the book.
Oh,
and I'm
thank
about
you.
halfway through it. And we actually went through an issue here in Norman that actually took decades to resolve. We had a small street, very small street right by campus named after one of the Grand Dragons of Oklahoma's KKK from back in the day.
Yes, right.
And there's a line in a chapter I read recently that was like, people lose their minds when you change their address.
Yes.
You would have thought I was like stripping them of all of their belongings.
Exactly.
And it was a big community fight, but that was my first realization that street names do matter.
Oh my gosh.
And change is hard. And your book covered so many different topics. I feel like it should be required reading for any city planner. So thank you
so kind
much.
of you to say. No, it's so interesting that you say that about people losing their mind, because I got this, and this might be in the book, or I'm talked about it before, but the similar issue in Hollywood, Florida, over a Confederate street name, and where there were people there who didn't actually agree, with this, with even these ideas of the Civil War as this honorable thing. And they had no interest in generally, but they would say, but I was born on Lee Street. I grew up on Lee Street. I brought my babies home from Lee Street. I'm lost without it, and it really gave me into my mind that people have such powerful feelings of connection to their street name, so I didn't think that was a good reason not to change it, but it really helped me to understand these connections and these powerful feelings, emotions people have about changing their street name.
So true. One of the emails, she didn't even live on the street anymore, but she grew up on the street. Not to mention half the street, all the old buildings had been torn down and new ones were in its place. But again, thank you so much. I look forward to reading other works from you.
Oh, that's so kind. Thank you. And thank you again for the pumping question. I really appreciate that.
We got to stick together.
Exactly. Great.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Clark. Ladies, thank you so very much. I didn't realize how quickly time passed. It was delightful question, in conversation. I was so enlightened. And,
thank you.
Pleased to listen to you. And I can listen to you for the next couple of hours.
Oh, that's so kind. That's so kind of you to say. No, I could talk about this stuff all day, as probably is obvious.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amanda,
Great.
for helping us. Dorothy, thank you so very much for all the.
My pleasure.
And I like to also thank our guests who took time to be with us today, this wonderful, beautiful, sunny day. I was talking to Dorothy that people would enjoy this beautiful weather because it's such a wonderful weather in January. It's raining in Oklahoma. So hope to see you guys with us next time. Thank you. Hope you have a wonderful day.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Okay, bye.